Professor Christopher Lund from Wayne State University.
So when the government imposes quarantine orders for public safety, it shuts some things down while leaving other things open. And in that world, how should religious organizations be treated? One response is that they should be treated equally, and it's a good response, but equality is not self-executing, and the deeper you go into these quarantine orders, the more that becomes clear. In my time, I want to convince you of two things. First, quarantine schemes require the government to make judgments about the value of religious exercise in uncomfortable ways. And second, quarantine schemes flatten religious difference in similarly uncomfortable ways. My first point, quarantine schemes require the government to make decisions about how much religious services are worth. Forget religious organizations for a second. Just consider non-religious ones. If you were in charge of deciding what things should open and when, you would naturally take into account the value of the thing in question. Grocery stores and hospitals are too important to close. Daycares open before other sites with comparable transmission risk because we know working parents need them. Determinations about when different things should reopen don't merely involve questions of fact, what's the amount of risk, but necessarily involve questions of value. Is it worth the amount of risk? California had a 5-stage reopening plan with different things opening at different times. Where do you fit religious organizations in? We must listen to this who can tell us about comparative transmission risk, but we also need someone to tell us about the comparative value of those things. And that creates the issue. Usually people make their own decisions about the value of religion. Some people might find religion valuable or invaluable or worthless, but they make their own decisions and the government usually doesn't. But now we're affecting each other more than before, and we have to make collective, that is governmental decisions about the value of religion. And it has to be this way, right? We have to classify organizations by type. If we only had generally applicable rules like indoor masks or 6 feet apart or buildings at 50% capacity, we wouldn't be able to prefer organizations of certain types like grocery stores and hospitals and daycares. So we have to classify organizations by type, but that requires judgments by the government about religion's worth. My second point, quarantine schemes flatten religious difference in uncomfortable ways. Look into the reasons governors gave for categorizing religious organizations where they did. Or look in the arguments in the litigated cases. Look into their judgments of transmission risk. You see a lot of talk about singing, for example. There's a lot of risk with singing. And if you looked at the governor's orders and you looked at the cases, that's your image of what happens at a religious service. But of course, not all faiths sing during religious worship services. Some faiths don't really even have worship services. We're figuring out what restrictions to impose on religious services generally, using some conception of what usually happens at a religious service. But that conception will be shaped by the practice of dominant majority faiths. To put it bluntly, these quarantine orders have regulated all faiths, as if all religious meetings look like Sunday morning Christian worship services. That's my time. Thanks for having me.